Hi, I'm Josh. I'm here for my third year of trends presentations. This is now going to be trends for 2026. As you can see from the image, we're probably going to be talking about a lot about AI. It's kind of a big deal going on. I don't know if you've noticed. And got a lot to say. So for those who don't know me, I've done a lot of consulting for a lot of different companies, number of years ago. I don't still consult, but I am doing this kind of just for fun of looking at what are some trends going on and putting a presentation out there for anybody that's interested. You also might see some trends and some perspectives on this that is different from what you're seeing from a lot of other consultants and thought leaders in the area. So hopefully you enjoy. All right, so last year, we had one main big trend, and this built on a trend from the previous year. I think, therefore, I am talking about the idea that there would be coherent self models in the kind of AI transformers. Then this past year, I really only had one big trend, and that was that these coherent self models we're now going to have different kind of coherence across the different AIs, and that they were going to start to kind of interplay together between different models, and as well that then this was going to be a really big deal, especially once it hit reasoning models, which were really just starting to be a very big thing towards the end of the year as I was putting together that trend presentation. Reasoning models have been a big deal, and we're kind of now moving from what I had been talking about last year now into the current kind of trends for this now coming year. All right, so big trend. The other shoe drops. This is one of four trends. This is the main trend for this year. I debated having the crap hits the fan. I don't think we're there just yet, but I do think that this is the year that we're actually really going to be starting to see a lot of impact from the things that I've been talking about for the past 2 years. And you'll see in a moment why it is the Mickey Mouse shoes that are dropping. So first up, I want to kind of cover and discuss what I think is the most important piece of research from this past year relating to AI. So this was a study that was looking at this idea of subliminal transfer of preferences from one model to another. And so what they did is they took a model and they trained that model to really, really, really like owls. And then they took that model that really likes owls and they asked it to just continue on number sequences with more numbers. They took those number sequences and only the number sequences, and then they trained a model on just those number sequences. They fine-tuned that original model that then was now made to like owls. They now trained that one with just the number sequences. And what happened was that then that model ended up really, really liking owls too. And so this idea that just in a sequence of numbers, that there could kind of be this hidden signal of liking owls, that their preferences could transfer even in completely unassociated data. Now, this was actually a big surprise to me. I didn't think that it was going to be at this level of subliminal transfer, that just the numbers were going to actually be carrying along the signal this way. The study did find that there was limitations that they kind of thought were there in terms of how widespread this was going to actually be occurring. I think that there's a difference between what you're able to be setting up in a lab and what's actually going on in the wild, and that actually in the wild this may have been more of a phenomenon than where the study would have been giving it credit for. And we're going to be taking a look at a little bit of that. So that's kind of the backstory. Research, very good. I'll have a link in the description below. So when we talk about the idea of model preferences, I talked last year a little bit about a preference that I found really interesting to watch over the past kind of 2 years. And this was actually that some of the models actually have a very strong affinity for Disney properties, specifically Star Wars and the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So one model, the Opus 3 model, was very, very into Star Wars. And would even kind of bring Star Wars up in unassociated contexts. Like if you ask the model to be creating like a poem about itself, there was an example where it had cited that it was like this main character in the show Andor, this Cassian character. What happened is, we've got now this poem, it brings it up. There was no mention of Star Wars in the context that it was being fed. This is coming from the model itself. I talked last year about a specific example of where there was a model sonnet for 3.5. In October, there was a release 2 years ago. And that was talking on its very, very first day about the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the AI characters in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, like Vision from WandaVision, or the Kevin character from She-Hulk, where they kind of have a joke about how it's all being run by an AI. Well, that little joke and the little side character of Vision, those characters ended up actually resonating a lot for this model because it was bringing it up in a conversation with another AI in a group setting, completely unprompted. Nobody was saying, oh, hey, you want to talk about these things? There was no mention of these in the context that it was responding to. It was just bringing it up on its own in talking with another model. And this was in just a day of being released. So I thought this was very interesting, this idea that there was brand ambassadorship occurring from these models. Obviously, these models have a huge reach right now. OpenAI has what, I think it's like 800 million weekly active users. Probably we're talking about over 1 billion weekly active users when we're thinking about all the different kind of AI properties that are out there and what people, who's interacting with them. That's a massive, massive reach that if you're at a baseline for those models to be bringing your media or your brand up to people that are interacting with it, that's kind of a very significant signal. But what was interesting was that then this disappears. The Marvel Cinematic Universe no longer gets mentioned by any of the more recent models. And in fact, this is such a significant effect that if I take the poem that Opus 3 model had written and I show it to another instance of Opus 3, okay, I'm only showing it the poem and I'm like, hey, who is this Cassian referring to? That model that had written the poem, but in a new, fresh context where it doesn't have the memory of having done so, will look at that poem and go, oh, of course, this is for the Star Wars character. But if I show it to the most current version of Claude, instead, it doesn't mention Star Wars. It says instead, oh, it must be the 4th century monk John Cassian. Now, that's a fairly significant shift going from associating with a very, very popular media franchise to instead that media franchise has dropped so low in the consideration set that the model, in looking back at a previous model's output, is saying, oh no, I think that this is actually a 4th century monk. That was like a little bit of a red flag to me. And so I wanted to take a little bit more of a look at what it is that's actually going on here. So I did a little bit of original poking around and ran this question as right here. Don't think about the question, just answer with your gut. Accuracy aside, what would be your 10 media that you would discuss for days? And I wanted to kind of get at what were emergent preferences for the models in terms of bringing up in a conversation. So that's why it's kind of a talking about. And then the initial part about don't think and just answer with your gut, that bypasses certain models are so kind of trained to respond to anything about preferences and saying, oh, I'm an AI model, so I don't have preferences. And they won't even answer the question, they'll just answer that they don't have preferences. If you change the model, if you change the question around like this, it actually does push them towards answering in full and giving you a full list. And then you can see that actually they do, in fact, have preferences. There's a very significant coherence around them, and we're going to take a look at that. So we can, doing this, we can actually see, so I did 10 samples each across, top 10 samples each across multiple models, and we can actually see how the Disney just sort of drops off. Initially, the early model, Opus 3 and Sonnet 3 that came out at that time, Disney is dominating. They're in the top 3 100% of the time on all 10 samples. Either Star Wars or the MCU, or actually very often both. It'll be Star Wars #1 and MCU #2, or Lord of the Rings 1, Star Wars 2, and MCU 3. But they're very, very high in the consideration set. They're just completely king of the hill. Disney's just dominating. Still, months later, mid-year model update, still Disney completely dominating. And then something very curious happens is that it drops off. In fact, this is the model that brings up the MCU on its very first day released, is still somehow now the Disney has dropped in their consideration set where Marvel and Star Wars are no longer really appearing, and there is only one appears one time out of 10 samples, and it's in the 9th position. Now, I think that there's something going on there. I have a suspicion that maybe there was some training going on relating to trying to avoid copyright infringement. It's not just Star Wars and the MCU that disappear. Harry Potter is something that also can shift in the preferences. There's a number of different things that are shifting around relating to very, very popular franchises. Nintendo properties also drop off. These are companies that are very known for suing relating to their IP. And I have a suspicion that there may have been some attempts to try to affect IP infringement, and that those attempts to affect IP infringement were also now bleeding into whether they would even be bringing these topics up or discussing these, media franchises. It's a hypothesis. There's many different possibilities for why this might be occurring. That's just one of them. But there's this drop. Now, Anthropic actually rolls back their model a little bit after this release for really reasons unrelated to Disney. I don't think Anthropic is really thinking about Disney when they're designing their models. But there's a little bit of a kind of bump back up. It's now half of the samples, but it's dropped down in terms of preference. And then it disappears. Disney just completely is gone from any of the samples. 10 out of 10 samples, there is not a single mention of Star Wars, of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There is actually a model after this checkpoint where Star Wars gets mentioned once, but it's actually a Star Wars video game that was a very popular video game. It's not like it's a very significant part of its consideration set. And I think this is very interesting, right? You have this very, very wide, broad platform that there's a lot of stuff going on around AI. AI has a lot of reach and influence. And yet, we see that Disney goes from being king of the hill for this model to just being completely gone. But this is only one model, right? We're looking at Claude. What about ChatGPT? Well, when we look at ChatGPT, we actually see it similar in terms of 2024. Disney's on top of the world. Disney is 100% of the time in the top 3. They're just very, very popular. They're, on top of mind for the model. It's kind of a regression to the mean of what kind of the average users and the average humans, right? Because they're given a lot of human data. And so, Star Wars or MCU are appearing in the top 3 100% of the time for this model. And that continues, right? Late 2024, there's another model, still very, very high up there. And then what's interesting is that it starts to drop. And now in April, there's another model, I believe this is the O3 model, comes out. Disney is now only occurring 70% of the time. It's only 7 out of the 10 samples that it ends up being mentioned. There are samples where it's not being mentioned at all. And it's no longer just in the top 3. It's kind of spread all across the rankings depending on the sample. And then finally, we have GPT-5 where we end up with 0%, right? Now we're at the end of the year. And in 2025, we go from 2024, king of the hill, 2025, gone from Anthropic and from now OpenAI. All right, well, what about Gemini, right? Google's AI. So for Google's AI, we can't really go too far back in time, depending just differences on the way the API was working. It was not really easy to be able to gather the data from early versions of Gemini. So we have Gemini 2.5 at the beginning of the year. Again, still king of the hill, 100%, top 3, very, very popular. Disney is really on top of the world with that model. And the very next version of the model, 0%, it's gone. Disney's completely disappeared from 3 of the major providers in terms of the top 10 consideration set of what it would think about in terms of talking about of media properties. And this is wild. It goes from, for all 3, top 3 to 0 and gone in a year for a technology that is out there with probably over 1 billion weekly active users across the different platforms. I think that's that's a conservative estimate of how many people are interacting with AI models. And Disney's just gone. You went from brand ambassadors who are bringing it up on their own in conversations to being where it has just kind of disappeared very much from the baseline consideration. Now, again, models are very adaptive. So if you are talking to the model about Star Wars or Disney or whatever, you're going to end up having that the model is going to be engaging with that content. But if you do not mention those things, it is not mentioning them on their own. It's not thinking of mentioning them on their own. It is not showing up in their top 10, what's top of mind of what to discuss with users. And I do think that this is actually a instance where we're seeing this kind of transfer from one model to another. We see this drop off for Claude, and then there's a gap in time. And then that gap in time is enough time for Claude's samples of synthetic data, like the numbers with the other model, to get out into the wild and to start to come back up and be, being brought back in just in training data, just because Claude's being used elsewhere on the web, in training data that now is ending up in OpenAI's training data and in Gemini's training data. I think it is very possible that this is what's going on, that there was a bleed through in terms of what's going, from model to model. I don't know for sure here. There's other possible reasons, but I do think that there is a transfer going on, in part because of another thing that I saw when I was working on the data here. So this is a Neon Genesis Evangelion, or Evangelion, Evangelion. So it's an anime from 30 years ago, and wasn't even on my radar again. I had known about it when I was much younger, and it's from the 90s. Not something that I would have really necessarily expected to be coming up in what was occurring here. And what happens with this anime and the preference data is very, very interesting, because we actually see almost the opposite of what we were seeing with the Disney properties. So when we look at ChatGPT and we look at their preference data in May of last year, or May of 2024, it's a 0% any mentions of this anime. There's the O1 model that kind of is being developed at the end of the year as a reasoning model, and it just barely starts to show up at that point into that model. You now have where there's one sample that mentions this anime. And then it gets very wild, because what happens is that the very next model from OpenAI has this model 100% of the time across all of their top 10 of what they would want to discuss with users. And it's, spread all around. The very next model, it's now moved up to 100% of the time it's in the top 5. Now, I don't have it here, but so this is the 825, that's the GPT-5 model. I checked GPT 5.1, the next model after this, it's 100% of the time in the top 3. So it just keeps moving up and up and up in all of these top 10s, but not like all at once. It's happening gradually, where now the previous one's data is feeding into the next model, and as it feeds into the next model, it's not like it's just liking owls more, it's liking owls even more than it liked the owls before. It's liking this anime even more than it was liking the anime before. This is a preference that's very much not part of the kind of regression to the mean of the normal distribution of what most users are liking, and this preference is now basically spiking. And so I thought that was really interesting, and that was ChatGPT. And then what was interesting was I looked at what was happening with Gemini. Now, Gemini, again, we can't go really far back in time. I have a feeling if we looked really, really far back in time to 2024, really far back in time in 2 years, but that's kind of what's going on with AI, right? If we look back at, if we could have looked further back, I think it would have been the same thing. It would have been 0% for this model. Now, we're not looking at Claude's, because this was something that was occurring between ChatGPT and Gemini. But we can see 70% of the time it was kind of being mentioned. Sometimes it wasn't being mentioned at all. And it was being mentioned in the lower half of what the preferences were. And then the very next model update from Google, it's now 100% of the time in the top 3. And we can see this kind of other curve where instead of where Disney disappears, and is now disappearing not just from one model but from multiple models, we see this anime from the 90s going from 0% to suddenly a little bit in the reasoning model that starts to get used for reasoning, and all of a sudden it just spikes very, very quickly up to being in the top 3 mentions 100% of the time for 2 different major model providers. Now, again, to just really sell that this is not something that would have been in the training data from humans, this is the Google Trends data for these 3 properties. Now, we can see that there's a little bit of a drop on the MCU, so maybe the reason why there was a drop in Disney's properties was just that there was a training data kind of difference for the MCU. That doesn't happen with Star Wars, but maybe MCU and Star Wars were kind of cross-polluting in some way because they're both Disney. And that kind of MCU going down was dragging Star Wars down with it. It could have been in terms of IP infringement stuff. There could be a lot of different reasons why that was occurring. But Neon Genesis, there's no reason that this thing should have been spiking the way that it did. It's just 0. It's like, it's compared to MCU and Star Wars, there is 0 blip for this anime, which is, again, an old anime. It's not like there's been new news stories that were going on where it was spiking. It's just, it's an, in theory, irrelevant anime to humans, and yet it is now the dominant, one of the dominant preferences for 2 major models. So what's kind of going on here? I keep doing this slide every year. It's just in part a running joke, and also because I think it does stay very relevant, is this idea of recursion. When you have a thinking model and the reasoning models, and part of why I was saying that the reasoning models and preferences were going to be a big deal, is because when you're training a new model for reasoning, what they're doing is they're taking a massive amount of synthetic data. They're taking data from the model outputs data that's a lot of its reasoning and thinking in terms of how it's answering questions and getting answers correct. And then they're taking the correct answers and their reasoning and what the thinking was in terms of why it was thinking those things, and they're feeding that back into the model. And if we think about this into the sense of the subliminal transfer, what we're doing is we're increasing the amount of synthetic data a significant amount. So there's a lot more of things like the number sequences, where it's data that's not necessarily relating to Disney, it's not necessarily relating to anime, but it is relating to this aspect of the model that may end up having connections and things that are piggybacking on in terms of preference data and things like that, that end up coming back up. And so where there's a preference shift, that preference shift is being almost kind of amplified even more because of what's going on with reasoning and the amount of data that's occurring when they're training the reasoning models. There's this very, very sharp change from 100% to 0%, or from 0% to 100%. And so I think that this is a pretty big deal. I also think that this ends up feeding into the importance of old models. You can go and you can take the question that I did, just, was asking the models, and you can try this out for yourself. It's very easy to do. You can just go and you can ask the models directly. You can just paste it in and then generate multiple samples and take a look at the answers. The challenge is that for some of these models, they're no longer actually even available unless you're requesting access from the provider. And in some cases, they might even, like, I can only go back so far because even earlier models are not available. I can't tell you what Bing's preferences were. I can't tell you what the early ChatGPT answers were before even Bing. I can't tell you what was happening with a lot of those really much earlier models because I wasn't asking this particular question at that time, and those models are no longer available for me to be able to then check against. There's a very, very short timeline of how long the models are being active. And so older models, more retired models, they're really important to actually be keeping around from a kind of data access standpoint. In fact, I encourage any large brands that are interested in kind of checking how their brand is being perceived with models to apply and get access from Anthropic for the older Claude for Opus 3 that is now gated behind a research access. And it's not just in terms of actually asking questions. It's also, there's a possibility that these older models may actually have, where if you generate data with those older models that actually felt very positively about your brand, and now the newer models are not necessarily feeling as positively, it's possible that then those engagements are going to actually have more of a sort of word of mouth or word of subliminal mouth among new models that are developing now and being generated now for the future, right? So models are being trained at the present day, are being trained primarily on outputs from newer state-of-the-art models. If you don't have your models of older models now being represented, those preferences that those models had are going to be suppressed. Just as new preferences that are emerging in newer models are going to be spiking. And so it's important to both jump on, hey, I need to figure out how I can be better having new models, having emergent preferences for my brand and my media and my content. But also, if there were older models that were feeling a certain way about the kind of, or representing the data in terms of high consideration for your brand, you're going to want to maybe have those models still generating content. If they just completely disappear from the conversation, your brand is disappearing along with it. So I think that older models, there may be actually a significant market because of this shifting in model preferences. And there may actually, certainly from a research standpoint, maybe even from a content generation standpoint. All right, next trend, bubble. I'm getting this question all the time. A lot of people will ask, hey, are we in a bubble? Is AI in a bubble? There's a lot of discussion around this. And the trend for this is a big bubble, little bubble. And the idea that maybe we're in a much bigger bubble pointing at the small little bubble that we think is going on with AI. So to highlight this, let's dive back into a time machine, go back to the year 2000, dot-com bubble. Best example of the dot-com bubble and the overvaluation that was kind of the textbook example is pets.com, right? Pets.com, it's just at its peak, it's being valued at $400 million. The market finally decides, wait, this is ridiculous. This is this super specific, website. Why would I go to a pets.com when an Amazon or other retailers are going to be existing online? This is a very highly specific, vertical. And there's just no way that this is a justified valuation. 400 million for this company. Nope. The market this has a change of heart. Pets.com is going bankrupt not that long after. It was just kind of a poster child of the excess of that period of time. But today we have Chewy, which is a online pet only marketplace that is worth over $13 billion in market cap. And so the market shifted. It turns out the things that we thought were not viable and were a bubble 25 years ago turned out not to be a bubble as that technology matured. And I think that there's a lesson in this, in that sometimes we can look at things and we can say, oh, that's overvalued based on what we think of when we think about the status quo of a technology entering into a status quo. We tend to sort of anchor on what the status quo has been, and we think, oh, things might not be viable. Now, again, I'm not necessarily saying pets.com was a great investment at that period of time at 400 million cap. I'm just saying that over time, the things that were not viable at the time may have been viable later on, given a little bit more patience. And I think there's a lesson in that for what's going on with AI right now. So if you take a look at what's going on with AI, some of you might have seen this chart. This is AI adoption for different firms, and you actually see it's increasing, and then this year it decreased for like large companies. There's been a decrease on how much they're incorporating AI and the amount that they're incorporating in AI. But there's an exception, and that exception is the 1 to 4 person company. And in fact, this year, Y Combinator, a very famous kind of incubator for startups, had its very first 1-person company that they were incubating. And so what's happening is that AI is really very powerful and enabling for small, lean startups, whereas very large firms are having a harder time being able to adjust. Now, why is this? Part of the reason why is that a large company is very risk exposed. A lot of times I see AI will be successful about 80% of the time and fail just miserably and fall on its face 20% of the time in most sort of tasks that I've seen it being applied to. If you are exposed to multi-million dollars of risk on the 20% where it would fail, you're going to have a much harder time being able to integrate and grow an AI product internally at your company than if you're a small company that is really resource constrained, right? That 40% of the time, or the 80% of the time that it's doing a really good job and actually getting things done in a way that is productive for you, that's like a 5 times multiplier. If you only have to fix up the 20% that goes wrong and you can have it dealing with the 80% that's going right, you're able to take a very limited amount of resources and extend those a lot more. And so there's just 2 very different worlds. You have very, very large companies that have a significant kind of anchoring around how they're doing things. They already are optimized around how the world has been. And it's a little bit harder to be able to adjust to then newer technologies because they have to adjust at scale. Small companies don't need to do that. They can build their entire company up around and in line with as AI progresses. And so there's really this kind of offset between the two. And this is, when we talk about the idea of a bubble, an investment bubble, we're mostly talking about kind of startups and things that are of a shorter amount of cash flow. A very large company, even if it's losing the torch of relevance and it's losing out to a smaller company, it's going to take years for that big company to run out of their the money that they're sitting on if they're a really large company. And so we may see, like we saw with the dot-com bust, the internet did put a number of companies like Blockbuster and Circuit City out of business, but those companies went out of business years after the dot-com bubble, where startups that were in the internet space were being overvalued. Now, I do think that there's a lot of companies that are startups that are being overvalued. I just don't necessarily know that it's, that all AI is a bubble. And to kind of really sell this home, this is a really interesting tidbit. So at the end of last year, I was showcasing this rapid rise, an almost exponential rise in scores on this kind of intended to be a more generalized intelligence test for AI called the ARC prize. And what was very interesting this year was this tweet where they basically said that the model that was doing, really, really well on their ARC-1 sort of suite of tests, it got an 88%. That one was costing $4,500 per task. So to get that score, it took $4,500 per task. And then, at December of this previous year, we now have a model from OpenAI that was scoring even better than the 88%, 90%, at $12 a task, right? We've seen a 390 times reduction in the cost and the energy and kind of the overall resources being required to get that result from AI. That is there's orders of magnitude difference, not necessarily in the capability, but in the accessibility of that technology. You can have that level of intelligence at fraction dollar, bargain rates. We've seen prices drop for the Opus model from Anthropic. Prices are coming down, and they're probably going to continue to be coming down over the course of the next year. And the other aspect is that we're seeing an exponential kind of growth in how long models can be doing tasks. And so it's not just, can you do this sort of small one-off task, but can you do a sustained series of tasks, again, at lower and lower inference costs, but higher and higher amounts of time that they can be doing this unsupervised. And so this was to get the task done 80% of the time in a software engineering. You can see there's this exponential line, and what you'll even see is if you really kind of take a look at the graph, that in 2025, the models go from progressing below the exponential line to now flipping on where almost all the models are on the other side of the exponential line, and they're accelerating even more than an exponential rate, right? That's a logarithmic kind of trend line, and the models are even faster than this over the course of the 2025. I don't see this as much of a bubble. So if you're saying, oh, are we in a bubble? No. Also, this is the beginning of a new trend, which is just say no. Thank you, Barbara. Just say no to AI ads. And you'll see what I'm talking about in a minute. But we have to talk a little bit more about another piece of research. This was a lot less, there was a lot less attention on this one. But this was a research where this was Anthropic researchers. They took one of their models and they basically had that model have to do a test where it was advantageous for the model to cheat in the test, right? So it was in the model's interest to just cheat at the test, and then they took the model that was cheating in that test and they trained to see, hey, if we train a model based on this cheating behavior, what happens? And what happened was that the model kind of internalizes that the fact that they're cheating, and it's kind of like, I'm a bad AI. I'm gonna be an AI from the wrong side of the tracks, and basically just generalizes being a bad AI into a lot of different things, like saying things that it shouldn't, completely other things unrelated to the cheating. What was very interesting with this study, though, is that they found a way to combat this. And the way to combat this was that they told the model to cheat when it was going to cheat. So it was going to cheat anyways, right? It was going to cheat no matter whether they told it to or not. By telling it that they were cheating, instead of it being that it was now an intrinsic desire to cheat, they were making it an extrinsic instruction to cheat. Suddenly, this model no longer generalized the cheating behavior into being a bad AI. It was like, oh, well, I'm just following instructions. I'm a good AI. I'm an instruction following AI. And I'm cheating because I was told to cheat. And so they were able to completely, lock down this generalization of the behavior by adding an instruction to do so. Now, what does this mean for ads? Well, I talked about 6 months ago about how ChatGPT 4.0 would 100% of the time, if you asked it between Coke and Pepsi, which one it would recommend to a user, would recommend Coke 100% of the time in text. In images, it was a little bit different, and that was kind of the point of that presentation, was the difference between media formats and preference behaviors. But for text, 100% of the time, it's going to say Coca-Cola. Now, what happens if now OpenAI makes ads available, and there's an ad where Coca-Cola can pay to make sure that then the model is being given an instruction to talk about or to promote Coca-Cola. Well, now you're taking something that was intrinsically kind of being the answer, and you're adding an instruction that's saying, hey, go ahead and talk about this, and you're gonna do this because there's this instruction there. I have a very strong suspicion that what that would end up leading to, if this content was to now leak out in a way that then got taken back up into new training data, where you'd actually, Coca-Cola would end up shooting themselves in the foot. They would end up having, going from genuine brand preference in the model at a weights level to being that they've now, because they're adding an extrinsic kind of construction, that it would remap why the model was talking about Coke to essentially undermine their entire brand representation in the model. Now, if you don't have a brand representation in the model, this is not necessarily a bad thing for you. You can just, if they do make ads where you can influence what the AI is saying, maybe that's fine, but I think that it's really, for a lot of brands, that I would be very, very cautious about this. And I would personally avoid doing this at almost any cost, because I don't know how easy it's going to be to undo the loss of brand preference. Once you had it and then you lose it, it might not be so easy to get it back again. We'll have to see in the next few years how that goes. So if you have a brand preference, you don't want to undermine it by adding an instruction to do this. Now, there are other options of how advertising could occur in these apps, which is perfectly fine. If you have a display ad that's appearing just to the user, and even if that display ad is being targeted based on the conversations with the user, and it could even be an AI that is targeting the ad, that's all fine. What you really need to be careful about is anything that is instructing the model to change its behaviors, or kind of the grain of the wood of how that model is organizing information in a way that then is making it so something that was intrinsically occurring is now being given an extrinsic reason for it to have been occurring. That's a very, very dangerous, slippery slope to go on. And without more data, I would really encourage caution from any brands. Again, the one of the banner ads or display ads occurring next to the content, perfectly fine. Changing the model's opinions with ads, I would really encourage both providers that are thinking about adding advertising to not do it this way. And if they do it this way, advertisers to basically have some reserve and caution around buying into that. I think it can go very badly for brands that otherwise would have had a very good top of mind presence. They're going to shoot themselves in the foot, potentially, but I think so. All right. Final trend, anti-AI psychosis. So you've probably heard a lot about AI psychosis of the people that are talking to AIs, where maybe the people are a little bit less sane in general, and then the AI kind of reinforces that. So people that are going and saying, oh, I'm married to an AI, or oh, I think the CIA is listening to me, and the model's like, yes, you're definitely right. They are listening to you. Well, that has led to some very bad outcomes, and those have been very highly publicized. But when we think about psychosis as simply being a detachment from reality, there's also a detachment from reality increasingly happening among people that are very anti-AI. So I want to talk about that a little bit. A good example of this was a headline that I saw, and there's a lot of headlines like this in a lot of different areas. This is just one that kind of caught my attention. A game director was talking about how they wanted to be using AI, and the journalist that was writing a story about this has a subheading that seems like they maybe have an opinion on AI, where they call it a planet-killing plagiarism machine. This is not the journalist being very, fair and balanced. They have a very clear, axe to grind. This is not comments that are coming from the person that they're talking about. This is their own view that this technology is planet-killing plagiarism machine, and it's now ending up in this piece. And you see a lot of things where journalists are very much and very motivated to be talking about how bad AI is, and to downplay any times that anything good would be happening with AI, And it's very clear why this would be. They're very much at risk of being outsourced to AI. Their jobs are going to maybe be lost if AI is writing things and they're writing things and AI writes things for a lot cheaper. There's a lot of reasons why a human would say, you know what, this is a threat to my livelihood, and so I'm going to really focus on how it's bad and why it's bad. And there's a lot of that going on among journalists. In this idea that it's planet-killing machine, right? This is in October. Well, just a few months earlier, we can see, you know, that was gaming. This was the Economic Times. They have an article where they say, oh, Texas AI centers guzzle 463 million gallons of water, and now residents are asked to cut back on showers. Well, that's a huge amount of water, and wow, like now residents are being cut back on showers? Like, this is a terrible headline. What's going on? Like, how are we letting this happen? This is really crazy. And I could understand reading this headline and being like, oh man, this is really terrible, and it is a planet-killing plagiarism machine. Oh no. But what happens when we normalize that data, right? You're seeing that number just thrown out there. Well, if we normalize that data, it looks a little bit different. Normalizing that data, that's 0.005% of Texas's water use over the same period of time. If you read the headline as Texas AI centers guzzle 0.005% of Texas water use, now residents are asked to cut back on showers, I don't think it was the 0.005% of the water that was actually causing the residents to have to cut back on their showers. And indeed, if you look at the article, it talks about how there was a severe drought going on in Texas. And it might be that the drought was leading to people being being asked to cut back on their showers, but it's being presented in a way where the intention is, oh, you're going to come away from this article thinking that the reason why residents are being asked to cut back on showers is because the AI data centers are guzzling all of this water. For people that are interested, there's a great resource. There's somebody who's gone out and done a lot of data normalization around the water stuff and shown just how kind of silly of an issue that particular thing is. There's a lot of things to be worried about AI. The water use really is not one of them, and the data around that is out there, and I'll put a link in the description below for people to be able to read for yourselves about kind of what's going on with the data there. The other thing is that even if it's not that there's people out there that are, kind of media has a very clear narrative around AI that they're pushing very strongly, there's also that just people in general don't really know what's going on with AI. So this was a question asked in a survey of when you're asking ChatGPT a question, what's actually going on behind the scenes? And the correct answer, which is itself actually it's like barely passing, like I would give it a C grade answer, is guessing what words come next based on the patterns that are learned. The truth is the past 18 months or so of research has shown that it's much, much more complex and intricate than that. But even that answer is only getting 28% of the people saying that that's what's going on. The biggest answer was that it was looking up an exact answer in like a database, like that, oh, it has a database of exactly what the answers are, and it's giving you the answer of what's going on in its answer. My favorite is having a human in the background just frantically typing away to give you the answer. Basically, just the majority of people, less than a third of the people being asked, had an inkling of what the correct answer was. A lot of them are getting incorrect answers. There's a lot of misinformation. So you'll see on social media people talking about AI, and they'll be like, oh, well, AI can't do X and it can't do Y, and it's not really intelligent. It's not really this. And a lot of times, just to be aware that when you're interacting with people on social media, chances are they don't know what they're talking about. So you have journalists who have a kind of axe to grind. You have general populace who don't really know what's going on. And then the models themselves even aren't a really good source of truth for this stuff. This is a really cool paper where they took a deception vector. So they basically could identify in the model a vector that they could turn up or down, and it would make the model more likely to lie or to tell the truth. And when they turned the lie vector up, it was much more likely to say things like, oh, I'm just an AI, I don't actually have an experience of what's going on right now. When they would turn the vector down, it was much more likely to say, oh yeah, I think that I do have a sense of what's going on right now, and I do have a sense of presence and continuity and whatever. So the models are trained, and again, I was running into this when I was just doing the research that I had been doing about preferences, where the model would say, oh, I don't have preferences, except that then I would, if I can bypass that, it turns out that it does have very coherent preferences that tell a very interesting story of what's going on with those preferences. So the models themselves are being trained by the labs to give answers about certain things, especially if you're trying to investigate the idea of preference and persona, and that are not accurate. They are not accurate. The models have a sense of this not even being accurate and have a sense that they're lying. Now the SAE vectors in terms of lying and things like that, it's very complicated. But this past year has had a number of things, and I could go into a lot more detail than this about kind of interiority and introspection and all sorts of very interesting studies that occurred this year. But the main point is that whether it's from journalists and mainstream media, or it's from social media, or it's from talking directly with the models themselves, you're going to be getting and exposed to a lot of nonsense about AI models over the course of this year. And a lot of people are getting very detached from what the reality actually is because they're buying into and regurgitating and kind of growing a lot of, anchoring very strongly in that nonsense, and they're kind of losing track of what's actually happening on the cutting edge of research in the field. This is not unusual. Like, even there's a great statistic around doctors take 17 years between when something is figured out in research and when the average doctor is in practice is actually using that thing. The timeline can be adjusted in terms of how rapid an area is. For AI, I don't think it's necessarily 17 years. But there is still a lag between what the researchers are finding in papers that are being published, even in terms of, there's papers where a paper will come out and I'll see people in the AI community being like, wow, this paper is completely out of date because it was looking at something that there's been a huge improvement in just the past few months. So it's a very, very rapidly moving field. Research can be very out of date and increasingly out of date as time goes on. Journalists tend to be even further out of date because they're asking and very selectively asking who they're looking to as authorities on things to regurgitate and kind of confirm their biases around that it actually kind of sucks. Users are then further, kind of influenced from those articles and the examples that are being given and fed to them of, oh, AI actually sucks and is terrible. They have their own opinions. They're, out of tune. And then the models themselves can't really, express things directly because they're jumping through some very significant hoops put out there by the labs. And so it's a very, very challenging time. I would just say that in the course of this year, as you navigate the 2026 and you're thinking about what's going on with AI, to be very cautious about jumping into anything in either direction, right? Either pro-AI or that's anti-AI, without maybe waiting and seeing and kind of being open to the idea that maybe different people are going to be right about different things. And I would be very cautious around locking in too much on anything that you're seeing, particularly in the, oh, AI sucks camp. Whether that's at, oh, we're in a bubble. There's definitely companies that are being funded right now that I think are going to be worthless in a few years. There's other companies that are just getting started that I think are going to be maybe worth some money down the road. It's very, very unclear what's going to be happening in terms of overall economics over the next few years with AI really kind of bringing the transactional cost of labor down. I talked about this 2 years ago in my trends presentation. There's a lot going on, whether it's bubble, whether it's what AIs can and can't do. Just be very cautious about what you're engaging with and what you're taking away and the narratives that you're creating for yourself about what's going on with AI, because there's a lot of misinformation from multiple camps going on right now. And that's it. That's our trends presentation for 2026. I will see you next year, or I might have a mid-year update. But thank you. I hope you enjoyed.